The morning sun cast long shadows across the Virginia countryside as 35,000 Union soldiers stirred from their fitful sleep. General Irvin McDowell stood atop a small hill overlooking Bull Run Creek, his field glasses trained on the Confederate positions beyond. The air hummed with anticipation and something else entirely. From Washington, distinguished spectators had arrived with picnic baskets and opera glasses, treating the impending battle like a grand theater performance. "Today, gentlemen, we end this rebellion," McDowell announced to his assembled officers, his voice carrying the confidence that had infected the entire Northern war effort. The plan seemed foolproof. Advance on the Confederate capital at Richmond, scatter the ragtag Southern Army, and have the boys home by Christmas. Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio had packed sandwiches and champagne, expecting to witness the Confederacy's swift collapse from a comfortable vantage point. Across the creek, Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard faced his own moment of truth with 22,000 men. The Creole general had positioned his forces along an 8-mile defensive line, anchoring his left flank on a stone bridge that would soon become infamous. Unlike his Union counterpart, Beauregard harbored no illusions about easy victory. His men were farmers and clerks, not professional soldiers, and many had never fired a shot in anger. The Confederate ranks buzzed with nervous energy as pickets reported massive Union movement to the north. Private Johnny Whitten of the 4th Alabama wrote in his diary that morning, "The Yankees come like a great blue snake across the hills. God help us all." His words would prove prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. As referenced in Bruce Catton's seminal work, The Coming Fury. The atmosphere on both sides reflected a nation still clinging to romantic notions of warfare, where battles were decided by gallant charges and wars concluded with gentlemanly handshakes. McDowell's battle plan called for a diversionary attack on the stone bridge while his main force crossed Bull Run at Sudley Ford, flanking the Confederate left. It was textbook military tactics, the kind taught at West Point. What the plan failed to account for was the fog of war that would soon descend like a suffocating blanket over the Virginia hills. At 5:30 in the morning, Union artillery opened fire on the stone bridge, the thunderous cannonade shattering the pastoral quiet. Birds exploded from the trees in dark clouds, and the very earth seemed to tremble. The war had begun in earnest, though neither side yet understood the monster they had unleashed. Colonel Nathan Evans, commanding the Confederate forces at the bridge, quickly realized the bombardment was a feint. Through his spyglass he spotted the dust clouds of McDowell's flanking column moving towards Sudley Ford. With remarkable presence of mind, Evans left a skeleton force at the bridge and rushed his main body to intercept the Union advance. The stage was set for America's first great battle, where illusions would die as surely as the men who carried them. Neither the picnicking spectators from Washington nor the confident generals on both sides could have imagined that this sunny July morning would mark the beginning of 4 years of unimaginable carnage. The romantic age of American warfare was about to end forever on the banks of a little-known creek in Virginia. The first shots rang out near Matthews Hill as Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Island Regiment encountered Nathan Evans' hastily repositioned Confederates. What began as scattered musket fire quickly escalated into a full-scale engagement, with both sides feeding more troops into the growing melee. The reality of combat struck like a physical blow. Nothing in the drill manuals had prepared these citizen soldiers for the chaos now engulfing them. Evans' small force of 1,100 men found themselves facing overwhelming odds as Union brigades under David Hunter and Samuel Heintzelman deployed across the rolling hills. The Confederate line began to buckle under the pressure, with men from the 4th South Carolina falling back in disorder. Yet something remarkable happened in those desperate moments. Instead of complete collapse, small groups of Southerners rallied around their battle flags. Buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive, General Barnard Bee's brigade came thundering up from the south, their gray uniforms already darkened with sweat and dust. Behind them rode the Hampton Legion, South Carolina aristocrats who had equipped themselves at their own expense. These reinforcements threw themselves into the battle with desperate fury. Knowing that the fate of their young nation hung in the balance, the Union advance pressed forward with mechanical precision, their superior numbers beginning to tell. McDowell's plan was working exactly as intended. The Confederate left was crumbling, and the road to Richmond lay open. Spectators on distant hills cheered through their opera glasses as the blue line swept forward. Congressman Albert Riddle of Ohio later wrote, "Victory seemed as certain as the sunrise." But war has its own logic, indifferent to human expectations. As B's men fell back before the Union onslaught, they encountered a sight that would become legendary. Atop Henry House Hill, a brigade of Virginians under Brigadier General Thomas Jackson stood in perfect formation, as motionless as a stone wall. Their presence radiated calm authority in the midst of chaos. "Look, men," B shouted to his retreating soldiers, pointing toward the hill. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." With those words, both a general's nickname and a turning point were born. B himself would fall within minutes, but his rally cry echoed across the battlefield. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the combatants. Men began dropping from heat exhaustion as much as enemy fire. The romantic image of warfare, clean uniforms, martial music, and glorious charges dissolved in the furnace of actual combat. Private Elisha Rhodes of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry later recalled, "The reality of war struck us like a hammer blow. This was not the grand adventure we had imagined." Confederate reinforcements continued to arrive throughout the morning. Joseph Johnston's army of the Shenandoah had slipped away from Union forces under Robert Patterson and was rushing to Beauregard's aid. The arrival of these fresh troops, transported by railroad, a military innovation that would define this war, gradually began to even the odds, as described in historical accounts from the National Archives. The battle's character was already shifting from McDowell's carefully orchestrated assault to a desperate slugging match where neither side could claim clear advantage. The Union forces, despite their early success, were beginning to show signs of strain. Many regiments had been marching since before dawn, and the Virginia heat was taking its toll. Officers struggled to maintain unit cohesion as companies became separated in the rolling terrain. The neat battle lines depicted in newspapers were giving way to the confused reality of modern warfare. By noon, the battle had become a seesaw affair, with both sides launching attacks and counterattacks across the contested ground. Neither McDowell nor Beauregard could claim victory, though both still believed in the righteousness of their cause and the inevitability of triumph. The afternoon would tell a different story. The battle's focal point had shifted to Henry House Hill, where 85-year-old Judith Henry lay bedridden in her small farmhouse, too ill to be moved despite the approaching combat. The irony was lost on no one. The war's first major engagement would swirl around a helpless invalid who wanted nothing more than to be left in peace. Her fate would become symbolic of a nation's lost innocence. Jackson's Virginia Brigade held the hilltop like an immovable fortress, their ranks dressed with parade ground precision despite the chaos surrounding them. These men, many of them VMI cadets and Lexington farmers, possessed an almost supernatural calm that seemed to radiate confidence throughout the Confederate line. When Union artillery began shelling their position, they absorbed the punishment. Without flinching, waiting for their moment to strike, General McDowell, observing the Confederate stronghold through his field glasses, made a fateful decision. He ordered Captain Charles Griffin's battery forward to silence Jackson's position, supported by the 11th New York Fire Zouaves in their distinctive red uniforms. It was a sound tactical move, neutralized the enemy's strongest point with concentrated firepower. The Union artillery wheeled into position just 400 yards from the Confederate line. close enough to see individual faces. Griffin's guns opened with devastating effect, tearing gaps in Jackson's ranks. For a moment, it seemed the Confederate position would crumble under the bombardment. Union observers cheered as gray-clad figures fell like wheat before a scythe. But Jackson had calculated the risk perfectly. As the Union battery worked to reload, he turned to his men with glacial calm. "Hold your fire until they come within 50 yards, then give them the bayonet." His voice carried across the hilltop with absolute authority, and his soldiers responded with the discipline of veterans despite their inexperience. The fire. Zouaves advanced up the slope in their gaudy uniforms, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. These New York volunteers had drilled extensively and considered themselves elite troops. Their colonel, Elmer Ellsworth, had been a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln before his death in Alexandria. Now his regiment would test themselves against Virginia's finest. What happened next shattered Union confidence like glass. Jackson's brigade rose as one man and delivered a devastating volley at point-blank range. The Zouaves' red uniforms made perfect targets, and men fell by the dozens. Before the New Yorkers could recover, Jackson's Virginians swept down the hill with fixed bayonets, their wild rebel yell echoing across the battlefield for the first time. Captain Griffin watched in horror as Confederate infantry overran his battery, capturing several guns and turning them on their former owners. The carefully planned Union assault dissolved into panic as men broke ranks and fled down the hill. The sight of their elite troops in full retreat sent shockwaves through the entire Union line. Mrs. Henry, trapped in her house as the battle raged around her, became war's first civilian casualty when an artillery shell crashed through her bedroom wall. Her death marked the end of any pretense that this conflict would be fought between gentlemen according to civilized rules. The war had come home to America with a vengeance. As documented in contemporary reports from Harper's Weekly, the transformation of the battle's momentum in those crucial afternoon hours demonstrated how quickly fortunes could reverse in modern warfare. Confederate morale soared as word of Jackson's success spread along their lines. Fresh troops continued arriving from the Shenandoah Valley, and what had begun as a desperate defensive action was transforming into something far more dangerous for the Union cause. The initiative was shifting, though neither side yet fully grasped the magnitude of what was occurring. McDowell attempted to rally his forces for another assault, but the psychological damage was spreading like wildfire through his ranks. Soldiers who had marched from Washington expecting easy victory now faced an enemy that fought with unexpected skill and determination. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, adding physical exhaustion to moral confusion. The stage was set for the battle's climactic phase, where illusions would finally die completely and both sides would learn the true cost of their romantic notions about war. Confederate counterattack began with the sound that would haunt Union soldiers for 4 years to come, the piercing rebel yell rising from thousands of throats like the cry of hunting wolves. General Beauregard, sensing the moment was ripe, ordered a general advance across his entire line. What had begun as a defensive battle was transforming into an offensive that would drive the Union Army from the field. Fresh Confederate reinforcements continued streaming onto the battlefield, their gray uniforms still clean and their enthusiasm undimmed by hours of combat. The arrival of Jubal Early's brigade from the railroad depot at Manassas Junction provided the final ingredient for victory. These men had traveled from the Shenandoah Valley in railroad cars, a military innovation that allowed rapid troop movement across vast distances. The Union line, which had held throughout the morning and early afternoon, began showing signs of fatal weakness. Soldiers who had been fighting since dawn were physically and emotionally exhausted. Many had consumed their water rations hours earlier, and the Virginia heat was claiming victims faster than Confederate bullets. Officers struggled to maintain unit cohesion as men began drifting toward the rear. McDowell, made desperate attempts to reorganize his forces, but the damage was spreading faster than he could contain it. The 11th Massachusetts Infantry, which had performed admirably throughout the morning, suddenly broke ranks when Confederate cavalry appeared on their flank. Panic, like a contagious disease, began infecting regiment after regiment. The psychological impact of Jackson's earlier success rippled through the Union ranks like a stone thrown into still water. Soldiers who had never faced serious opposition before found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The romantic notion of warfare as a glorious adventure was dying in the Virginia dust. Captain William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding a brigade of Ohio volunteers, watched with professional interest as his carefully planned battle dissolved into chaos. This red-haired officer would later remember Bull Run as his first lesson in the true nature of modern war. The whole affair was more like a mob than an army, he would write years later. Confederate artillery, previously outgunned and outmaneuvered, found new life as captured Union batteries were turned against their former owners. The irony was not lost on Southern gunners who had spent the morning dodging Northern shells. Now they could reply with interest, using superior Union equipment against its original operators, the civilian spectators from Washington who had come expecting entertainment, found themselves fleeing for their lives as the battle turned against Union forces. Congressmen and senators abandoned their picnic baskets and opera glasses, joining the growing stream of refugees heading back toward the Capitol. The party atmosphere had been replaced by genuine terror. As noted in official military dispatches, preserved in the War Department archives, the transformation of Bull Run from Union victory to Confederate triumph occurred with stunning rapidity, catching commanders on both sides unprepared for such dramatic reversal. Individual acts of heroism still flickered throughout the Union retreat. Colonel Andrew Porter's regulars maintained discipline even as volunteer regiments dissolved around them. These professional soldiers understood that retreat required as much skill as advance, and they covered the withdrawal of less experienced units with selfless courage. But heroism could not disguise the fundamental reality. The Union Army was in full retreat, and retreat was rapidly becoming a rout. The carefully planned offensive that was supposed to end the rebellion in a single decisive blow had instead demonstrated that the Confederacy would not collapse at the first push. The afternoon sun, which had witnessed such confident Union advance, in the morning now illuminated a scene of complete reversal. Confederate flags flew from positions that had been Union strongholds hours earlier. The initiative had passed completely to Southern hands, and they intended to make the most of their opportunity. What began as an orderly Union withdrawal rapidly degenerated into one of the most humiliating routs in American military history. The retreat that would be mockingly dubbed the Great Skedaddle by Confederate newspapers transformed McDowell's army from a disciplined military force into a panicked mob streaming toward Washington in complete disorder. The collapse started with the 1st Massachusetts Infantry, veteran soldiers who had maintained their composure throughout the day's fighting. When Confederate cavalry appeared on their left flank, these experienced troops began what should have been a tactical withdrawal. Instead, their movement triggered a chain reaction of panic that spread through the Union ranks like wildfire, consuming dry grass. Soldiers threw away their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape, littering the roads with muskets, cartridge boxes, and knapsacks. Entire regiments dissolved as men abandoned their units and struck out individually for Washington. Officers lost control of their commands as military discipline evaporated in the heat of terror and exhaustion. The scene on the roads became increasingly chaotic as military retreat merged with civilian flight. The Washington spectators who had come to witness Confederate defeat found themselves caught in the maelstrom of military disaster. Congressmen and socialites abandoned their carriages when the vehicles became trapped in the press of fleeing soldiers, continuing on foot alongside common privates from Iowa and New York. Confederate pursuit, though vigorous, remained surprisingly limited. Southern commanders, as shocked by their sudden victory as their opponents were by defeat, failed to press their advantage with the ruthlessness that might have destroyed McDowell's army entirely. The rebellion that Northern politicians had dismissed as a temporary insurrection had just demonstrated its capacity for serious military resistance. Private Warren Goss of the Massachusetts 2nd would later describe the retreat. "We were no longer soldiers but a crowd of panic-stricken men, each thinking only of his own safety." His honest assessment captured the complete breakdown of military order that characterized the Union withdrawal from Bull Run. The psychological impact of defeat struck Union soldiers harder than physical exhaustion. These men had marched from Washington expecting to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. Instead, they had encountered an enemy that fought with skill, determination, and growing confidence. The easy victory promised by politicians and newspapers had proven to be a dangerous illusion. Confederate forces, initially content with driving the enemy from the field, gradually realized the magnitude of their opportunity. Some units pursued the retreating Union columns, capturing prisoners and abandoned equipment. Others remained on the battlefield, too exhausted and disorganized to maintain effective pursuit of their demoralized opponents. The road to Washington became clogged with the debris of military defeat. Abandoned artillery pieces, overturned wagons, and discarded personal belongings marked the route of Union retreat. Confederate cavalry harassed the rearguard when possible, but the majority of McDowell's army escaped. Destruction through sheer speed of withdrawal rather than military skill. President Lincoln, waiting anxiously in the White House for news of victory, instead received reports of catastrophic defeat. The war that was supposed to end in 90 days had just taken on an entirely different character. The Union cause, which had seemed so righteous and inevitable that morning, now faced the prospect of a long and bloody struggle. As documented in contemporaneous accounts from the Washington Evening Star, the arrival of defeated troops in the capital created scenes of chaos and demoralization that shocked civilian observers who had expected triumphant celebrations. The retreat continued through the night, with exhausted soldiers stumbling through darkness toward the safety of Washington's fortifications. Many units would not achieve complete reorganization for days, and some regiments were so scattered that they ceased to exist as effective military formations. By dawn on July 22nd, the bitter truth was undeniable. The Union Army had suffered a crushing defeat, and the Confederate States of America had proven their capacity for serious military resistance. The age of illusions was ending, replaced by the harsh reality of civil war. The sun rose on July 22nd over a transformed America. In Washington, the streets filled with defeated soldiers, their uniforms torn and their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had seen their certainty shattered. The capital city, which had celebrated the Army's departure with parades and speeches, now witnessed its return in silence, broken only by the shuffle of exhausted feet and the groans of wounded men. President Abraham Lincoln stood at his office window, watching the procession of defeat with characteristic melancholy. The reports from his generals painted a picture of complete military collapse, but the political implications struck even deeper. The war that Congress had authorized for 90 days would clearly require a commitment of resources and duration that few Americans had imagined possible. In Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis received news of victory with mixed emotions. While the military success vindicated Southern claims of martial prowess, Davis understood that Bull Run represented only the beginning of a much larger struggle. The Union would not accept defeat gracefully, and the Confederacy's next test would be far more severe than anything they had yet faced. The casualty reports from both sides revealed the battle's modest scale compared to what would follow. Union losses totaled approximately 460 killed, wounded, and missing, while Confederate casualties numbered around 380. These numbers, which seemed catastrophic to contemporary observers, would pale beside the slaughter. At Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, General McDowell, the architect of defeat, faced immediate removal from command. His carefully planned offensive had foundered on the reality that wars are won by soldiers, not by strategic theories developed in comfortable offices. The Union would need new leadership and, more importantly, a new understanding of the enemy. They faced the Confederate victory created its own dangerous illusions. Southern newspapers proclaimed that one Southerner could whip 10 Yankees, a boast that would prove costly when the Union returned with larger armies and better leadership. The ease of victory at Bull Run masked the reality that the Confederacy had won a single battle, not the war itself. Perhaps most significantly, Bull Run shattered the romantic American conception of warfare as a glorious adventure, where brave men settled their differences through honorable combat. The panic-stricken retreat, the civilian casualties, and the sheer chaos of modern battle revealed war's true nature as organized brutality that respected neither courage nor good intentions. The international implications rippled far beyond American shores. European powers, which had dismissed the American conflict as a temporary disruption, began to reconsider their positions. The Confederacy had demonstrated military competence that suggested potential for independence, while the Union had revealed weaknesses that might be exploited by hostile foreign nations. As analyzed in subsequent historical studies, including those found in the Journal of Military History, Bull Run marked the transformation of American warfare from amateur enthusiasm to professional military science, a change that would define the conflict's remaining years for the common soldiers. On both sides, Bull Run. For the common soldiers on both sides, Bull Run provided harsh lessons in the realities of 19th century combat. The volunteers who had enlisted expecting brief service and easy glory now understood that they faced years of grinding warfare against opponents who would neither surrender easily nor fight according to gentlemanly conventions. The battle's aftermath also revealed the inadequacy of existing military institutions for prosecuting modern war. Both armies had fought with equipment, tactics, and organizational structures designed for conflicts against foreign enemies or frontier irregulars. Civil war required innovations that neither side had anticipated or prepared for. In the weeks following Bull Run, both governments began the massive mobilization efforts that would transform their societies. The Union called for additional volunteers and began the industrial expansion that would eventually overwhelm Confederate resistance. The Confederacy struggled to capitalize on its victory while building the governmental and military institutions necessary for sustained warfare. The First Battle of Bull Run thus stands as more than a Confederate tactical victory or Union defeat. It represents the moment when Americans on both sides abandoned their illusions about easy victory and confronted the reality that their differences could only be settled through years of unprecedented bloodshed. The romantic age of American warfare died on the Virginia hills, replaced by the grim professionalism that would characterize the remainder of the Civil War. The young nation that had celebrated its military departure from Washington in July 1861 would never again view warfare with such innocent enthusiasm. Bull Run had taught America the true cost of civil war, and that lesson would shape every battle that followed until Appomattox Courthouse finally brought peace to a transformed continent.